Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, the tale is told, met Elijah the prophet and asked him, "When will the Mashiach, the Messiah, come?" Elijah answered, "Go ask him yourself." "Where is he?" asked Rabbi Yehoshua. "You can find him at the gates of Rome," Elijah said. Rabbi Yehoshua asked, "How will I recognize him?" Elijah answered, "He's sitting there among the lepers, whom you will find unwinding all of their bandages at the same time, then replacing them all together. The Mashiach is the only one who unwinds and rewinds them one at a time, thinking, 'I want to be ready at a moment's notice if I'm called.'" So Rabbi Yehoshua goes and finds the Mashiach outside the gates. But rather than what's said in that encounter, to me, the most powerful piece of the story is what's not said. Rabbi Yehoshua never says, "Wait, the Mashiach is with the lepers? The Mashiach is a leper?" But indeed, the Messiah is not only among, but actually embodying one viewed as an outcast in society. And no one bats an eye. What a portrait of radical inclusion, that the pathway to the Messianic era flows through the recognition that no one is other, that everyone belongs. We all belong. My friend Reverend Shalom Agtarap put it something along the lines of, everything belongs, so how do we practice belonging in ways that extend it to everyone? Because the reality we live in is that not everyone belongs. At Havurah, we've been using this language of belonging in our internal anti-racism efforts, and I'm going to touch on that a bit. But my intention for tonight, in the spirit of our theme this year, Havurah, is to explore more broadly this notion, this practice of belonging. Through various lenses, personal and collective, as a people and in our world. The story about the Mashiach, it's beautiful. And this model of extending belonging appears throughout our tradition. The commandment to love the stranger, the injunction to leave the corners of our fields for those who are poor. And in practice, over the generations, we've created among us amazing networks of belonging, ways we've been there for each other in times of joy and sorrow, ways we've protected and cared for each other, and ways we've helped each other find meaning and holiness. As Jews, we've practiced belonging. We also find many examples within our tradition of exclusion toward women, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, among others, as well as chauvinism in regard to other peoples, examples in Torah of non-Israelites, and in later rabbinic tradition of non-Jews being viewed as inferior to us. As Jews, we've practiced othering. Like our people, we all foster belonging, and we all other. I love lifting up examples of radical belonging in our tradition as a way of inspiring and nurturing those capacities within us. And we can't shy away from the ways that we, as a people, as a community, and as individuals, have the capacity and often the tendency to other. In one of my classes during rabbinical school, with the brilliant Rabbi Sarah Lev, we explored the appalling question, absolutely appalling question raised in Talmud and Midrash of whether the prohibition against theft extended to theft from non-Jews. Sarah embraces these disturbing parts of our tradition. She's adamant that we need to dig into them so that we learn more about who we are. All these years later, I still remember the final presentation of my classmate, now Rabbi Maurice Harris. In it, he explored the various ways in which the term re'ah is used, often translated as neighbor, as in ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. It often means something closer to friend or companion. The word appears in texts which the rabbis were parsing determined the answer to this revolting question. In part, the ruling hinged on how to define that word. Who exactly is my re'ah? Where do I draw the boundaries of the categories neighbor or friend? Ultimately, theft is prohibited, thank God, but in some readings for practical or protective reasons, and only in one text explicitly through what Rabbi Maurice called a big re'acha world. In other words, a more expansive definition of friend or neighbor. Sadly, most of the other readings imagined what he called a small re'acha world. But I still carry with me the foundational question that Rabbi Maurice posed to us. Which re'acha world do you want to live in? The implied answer, of course, the big re'acha world. Or as John A. Powell, director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, names it, a larger, more inclusive we. We need to continue growing into that larger we, to keep building it together, which hasn't always been an easy thing for our people to do. As I grapple with these disturbing elements of our tradition, I remind myself that this exclusiveness did not emerge by happenstance. The more threatened a person or people feel, the less likely they are to open up to the world, the more likely to define themselves as over and against an other, rather than extending belonging outward to foster a narrower belonging through a posture of othering. There's a progression that reflects this regarding the language of the Jews as chosen people, God's chosen people. It's one of the classic examples of Jewish chauvinism, defining ourselves as more select in some way than others. As many of you know, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, founder of the Reconstructionist movement, removed all reference to chosenness from the liturgy. That's why, if you don't know, you're not going to find it in these machzorim, these prayer books that we're using. And it actually was specifically at the Reconstructionist Minyan in Jerusalem 23 years ago, opening the Kol HaNeshama Sidur and seeing that I felt like I had found a place in the Jewish world. As my colleague Rabbi Toba Spitzer explains, though, Kaplan argues that the biblical conception of chosenness was similar to many ancient communities' understandings of themselves as a distinct people at the center of history. However, Rabbi Toba goes on, quote, Kaplan argues that Christianity set itself the task of realigning mankind into the chosen and the damned. In this process, the Jewish people was singled out as the people which, having at one time been the elect of God, repudiated him and thereby became a people accursed and damned, end quote. So the Jewish reification of chosenness, the ways it became more central to our practice and worldview, was a defensive response to anti-Semitism. I carry that awareness within me as I bristle at some of what I find in our tradition. Not surprisingly, in light of all the ways we've been persecuted, that strain of othering has not disappeared. And as John A. Powell explains, othering has very different consequences depending on context. As he puts it, when othering is done by the most powerful in society, when othering is done by people who control the police, who control the military, it has a different valence. And as I began writing this talk, I felt the clear need to speak about belonging and othering in part through the lens of Israel and Palestine. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge that just by saying those words, there's probably heightened emotion in the room, maybe in our remote room as well. Perhaps some of you might expect or want me to say or not say very specific things. So I want to say a bit about why I'm saying what I'm going to say. I am not here to rail against Israel, or rail at all, actually. This is really a talk about belonging. These ideas of belonging and othering, which are at the heart of what it means to be a human being in community, have particular lessons for us as a Jewish community to reflect on. Lessons that aren't simply about feelings and inclusion, but become entrenched in structures that have monumental consequences. And one of the ways in which these tensions between belonging and othering play out for us most dramatically and painfully, is in Israel and Palestine. It's also important for me to say that some of my most profound experiences of belonging have been as a Jew in the land of Israel. The tradition of spiritual Zionism, which isn't about a state, but is about the power and meaning enabled through the renaissance of Jewish life and community in Eretz Yisrael, worked in me. I am a product of that. I can't imagine there being much chance at all of my standing here today if not for my time in Israel and the sense of belonging that I felt there. So that feels very important for me to name. All that being said, through many days, weeks, months, several at a time, adding up to a few years' worth of living there, increasingly crossing borders, listening and encountering, learning and growing, I came to realize that my sense of belonging was also enabled through the othering of the Palestinian people. I do not believe that it has to be that way, but that is how the state of Israel is structured, which is to say that it is a nation structured around Jewish supremacy. I know that to some that feels like a provocative phrase, but to me it feels like a basic truth. Supremacy doesn't mean that non-Jewish citizens have no rights, but the rights of Jews are distinct from and superior to those of Palestinian citizens of Israel. The structure is set up for Jews to have greater access to power and freedom and dignity. And when it comes to Palestinian non-citizens of Israel, that is, Palestinian residents of the occupied territories, millions of people completely disenfranchised within a government that ultimately controls their lives, Jewish supremacy is a mild phrase to use, in my opinion. As Peter Beinart pointed out in his recent presentation that many of us were on, the state of Israel is held up by white nationalist leaders as a model of ethno-nationalism. I find that chilling. I once spent 3 months in a yeshiva, a place of learning in the West Bank. The teachers there were kind and generous and welcoming. They were passionate about Torah and prayer and about the land of Israel. This was in the middle of the Second Intifada, Palestinian uprising, and right before Ne'ilah, the moment we will reach tomorrow at the closing hour of our most sacred day of the year, toward the end of a powerful day of prayer, the head teacher, the Rosh Yeshiva's Drash, was about praying for us to be able to hold on to our land from those who want to take it from us. I remember walking the streets of Jerusalem shortly after that. I vividly recall walking down the street and saying to myself, can't we feel this passionate about being good human beings? In other words, does it have to be about land or about particular narrow ways of viewing our tradition and our people? Maybe deep down I was asking something like, can't we practice belonging without othering? And indeed, ultimately, some of my most powerful experiences of belonging in that land have been through encounters with Palestinians, a different, more expansive kind of belonging, a bigger Re'acha world. I believe that world is possible. I believe we are capable of exercising that moral imagination. Our people have practiced it from ever since. Alongside the strains in our tradition and history of fear of the other, there is so often a counter-tradition. All the way back to the writers of the Torah composing that beautifully intimate encounter between the angel and Hagar, the quintessential other. The thread of a larger belonging has snuck through the cracks. So can we imagine honoring and tending to the wounds our people carry from generations of the most vicious othering? The very real fears that are still present within us, while also beholding clearly the horrors that the Palestinian people endure at the hands of the Jewish state? Could we imagine through it all seeing that we actually all belong to each other? That may feel naive to some, but there are Israelis and Palestinians nurturing that vision as we speak. Bringing this practice of belonging back to our context within Havurah, specifically the work of anti-racism, what I want to say is that in this case, we are not expanding our notion of the we. We are awakening ourselves to the fact that our we has been distorted, made to seem more narrow than it actually is. It's been infected by the othering in our broader society, our broader American society, telling us that the North American Jewish community is only white, which has clearly never been true, but is a message woven into most of the Jewish community. So we need to undo that within and amidst ourselves. I see it as a process of reclaiming and reaffirming the we that we are. And we are not going to get it right all the time. I know I have not so far. I know we have not so far. But I trust in this vision of belonging. And I'm excited to be pursuing it, which is what we must do, because belonging must be practiced. It demands of us and offers to us continual movement, stretching, self-reflection, and growth. My friend, Reverend Chris Dela Cruz, shared with me that he often feels on the margins of his own community. He doesn't feel a need to leave there, though, because from that place, he loves accompanying others on the margins. He told me that he used to think he needed to bring people into the center more, but now instead, he's moved to help create belonging around them. I love this. What might it look like to nurture belonging on the margins of our community rather than seeing everything from the point of view of the center? I sense that being more mobile and dynamic might make way for new and varied forms of belonging. There is so much beautiful, challenging work to do. Recognizing and responding to the ways in which some of us are othered structurally, tending to the ways in which we all feel on the outside in some way or another. It is so important in all of this that we each nurture our own needs to belong, and that we care for and accompany each other in this however we can, however we need to. The practice of creating communities of belonging is unending and more consequential than we might realize. As Dr. King said, for some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. No matter how hard we try to separate ourselves from one another, willingly or unwillingly, we are not separate. To practice belonging is to continually return to that awareness, to continually return to that reality, and to align our words and our actions with it. In intimate settings and in ever-widening circles, to let that divine structure of which Dr. King speaks uproot the structures that we have inherited. Friends, may we do much uprooting in this year to come, so that we make way for the deeper structures of belonging at the heart of who we are. Gamar Chatima Tova, Shana Tova.